Everybody, welcome to this series of writing for publication sessions that I'll be running this week. Just for those of you who might have forgotten who I am, my name is Professor Tennyson Mukuchini. I'm the facilitator for this evening, for tomorrow, and I think the next day. So we have a three-part series that looks at writing for publication. Of course, as always, I will just go through some of the administrative things to do with how this session will run. We firstly, just to contextualize everything, I'm sure all of you have in one shape or another been advised of the fact that the university have expectations that in particular our doctoral students write manuscripts that are set for publication, and of course the master students are expected to complete a paper that is ready to submit for publication. So you all have very similar journeys to travel, some of you a little further than the others, but the requirement for you to be competent in writing for publication has never been as explicit as it is now. So this session is not an option in many ways, it's a requirement. So just as a quick note of tonight, I will, in a short time, be turning off my video so we can focus on the actual presentation for the day. And for those of you who need to access this later, you will be provided with a link for the session, and I think by now many of you know exactly what to do to get to these things. We are also finalizing, we actually have a YouTube link, but I looked at some of the videos and I wanted them just to be edited a little bit so that when we give you the link, you get to access the exact material we want without any unwanted additional bits to it. So at the end of the session, and I hope to take a little bit under an hour or thereabouts, the end of the session, I will entertain questions. Also, just as an additional awareness about what's upcoming, you will remember that last week we sent out an announcement, probably a little bit after the session, in which we indicated to everybody that we will be circulating information in weeks to come, probably in the next 2-3 weeks, inviting you all to submit elements of your work so we can offer comments and so forth and everything. Just for the purposes of being aware, we are supporting thousands of students. So on any one night, we can have 800 or so students, and the entire program is hosting close to 5,000 very active students. So when people submit things, we kind of have to make sure we have all the readiness to be able to respond in time. And that is why we've taken a little bit of time to get this all ready for you. In any case, tonight is about writing for publication. And I will now just share the screen that we have around this presentation. And okay, excuse me. So I've said that we are presenting these writing for publication sessions in 3 parts. And basically we're talking to you about the journey you need to travel from having data or having a story to tell to the manuscript that you do. So the whole writer's journey. And we speak about the different steps in developing a manuscript for publication. Interestingly, as you will see, the requirements of how to write an article are very similar to the requirements that you would have really for developing any other substantive piece of research. Your proposal seems to take a similar shape. your thesis or dissertation takes a similar shape. Any of you who apply for grants, you will notice that the logic and the way you present and ready yourself for the task ahead involves very similar components. All that changes is the purpose of what it is that you're trying to do. So when we talk about writing for publication, we're really talking about people writing articles that they intend to have in journals or chapters that they intend to have in books. And the history of all this is that it was always understood back in the days of old university life. It was always understood that you could have thousands of students and not every single one of them would be able to publish, because publishing was for those who had a unique and somewhat exceptional story to tell. But of course, now we require you all to publish, but the rules have not changed. The rules about your work needing to stand out, the rules about your work needing to be saying something that's different from what is already commonly available, all those rules remain unchanged. So literally the job has gotten a bit harder. There's many more of you trying to be different, but being different in the type of contribution that you make. So with that as the initial point of departure, I want to give a brief overview of what these 3 sessions that we're talking about will broadly do. We want to develop your competence firstly in assessing your own writing or publication potential. And that goes back to the fact that not everything that we have in our minds or have data on is worth writing about. And it's important that you assess what the potential of the material you have in front of you is when it comes to it being published. So, and that assessment is as good and as necessary a step as anything else that we share with you, because a wrong assessment will lead to failure ultimately. So it's, think about this as any task, someone who's high jumping, doing high jump, before they decide or they even attempt to jump a particular height, they need to get a sense of whether really, when they think of the task ahead, do they have what it takes? So this is what the assessing writing and publication potential really relates to. Secondly, the other issue is we need to share with you and teach you about the range of approaches that people will use to determine their target publication. So it is not an uncommon occurrence that a person can write a paper and that paper will be good enough for journal A, but not good enough for journal B, C, D, and all the others. And it's important that you have some type of systematic way of deciding what journal makes for the best target for you to go for. At this point, I'm speaking primarily with journals, because really that's where much of the publication we're talking about happens. The publication of chapters and things is a very different process, because generally when you write a chapter, it is on the basis of an invitation. So people don't compete as much for chapters because they are invited to submit the chapter, and by the time they're invited, already provision has been made for their work in a book. You will note that we speak about this thing called accreditation status, an impact factor. And in simple terms, and I'll get to it a bit later on, but it's good that we speak about this. So in the world, actually, there's a little over, I think it's 78,000 journals that are recorded in some shape or form. And not every one of those journals is a good place to publish in. Some are just novelty journals where people are, they don't care what you submit as long as you're willing to pay money for it to be published. Then there are scholarly journals that are revered for being leading sources of leading thoughts within their field. So those journals tend to they need to differentiate themselves from others, and they do so by a range of things. The first thing is we talk about peer-reviewed journals. So in simple terms, we're saying that this journal is a journal that has a group or a single person or a group of people from that subject field who are considered to be experts, and they review the work that arrives so that by the time it's published, it's acknowledged as being of sound content and value and credibility by peers. So that's peer review. Then the other format or type of thing that we refer to is this idea of accreditation. And accreditation is it's a very South African term. In South Africa, what the Department for Higher Education and Training, who are kind of the overseers and the custody masters of our publications, have a system where they give accreditation to journals that meet particular criteria. Journals that are sufficiently scholarly, they get accredited. So for you as students and going forward from here on, at this point, you're only interested in accredited journals. And I will tell you how you determine if something is accredited or not. If a journal is not accredited, then you don't have any purpose in submitting to it, because it's no different, at least within our scale, as you submitting to a friend who has a journal at the corner who says, submit to me and I'll publish your work. Then the next thing that we talk about is the impact factor. And that relates to a measure. It's an indice, a measure that is used within the world of journals to determine what level of impact a particular journal makes to a particular discipline. So if it's a journal that's forward thinking and is the one that houses all the forward thinking thoughts within a particular discipline, you would expect it to have a high impact factor. If it's a journal that's not contributing any new knowledge, then it would have a low impact factor. So we will teach you methods for determining the target publication that you want, and also teach you ways to be able to determine what the peer review status of that journal is, what the accreditation status of that journal is, and also how you take note of the impact factor and how you utilize all those things to give you a decision about whether this is the target, that this is the journal and publication you want to target for your paper that you're working on. Then the other thing we want to do is we need to train you. We need to train you to be able to determine topical or relevant subject discourse. And basically what this is about is training you to be able to write and position any paper you write in such a way that it sounds very topical, it's catchy, it has all the hook lines that make it something that publishers would want to publish. Then, of course, we'll do what is quite actually very straightforward, but it has to be done all the same, is just walk you through how you develop and structure a paper. Of course, I will walk you through the standardized way of developing and structuring a paper, but be assured that different journals have adopted things and changed things a little bit. And the best way to know is that once you've got your target journal that you want to go to, you go and you look at a number of issues that the journal has got, and you just look at how they've structured their papers. Do they begin with the background? Do they begin with introduction, and so forth and so forth? But in any case, we would have shown you the more standardized way of doing it. Now, okay, so as I've said, we will speak you through writing for publication. We're going to give you a guided tour to the journey. Now, here goes. Okay, so remember we spoke about assessing your writing and publication potential. We introduced you to a peer progression model, and really this peer progression model is really more to do with you writing in groups and so forth. Then we need to also clarify this issue around the different types of papers that are possible to write, you know, and this is two types of papers exist in general. So the first paper is data-led, or they call it research-led or primary research-led paper. So if you did your study, like you're currently all working on your studies, and that study that you do is referred to as primary research, because the person who records what they saw is the person who had primary involvement with the data sources. So any research where a person is telling us exactly what happened in a study and what they did is what we call primary research, and it's the most popular type of journal. And it's the one that's favored the most, literally by the real simple understanding that this is from the horse's mouth, and if it's from the horse's mouth, no better credibility can be assumed except acknowledging that if it's come straight from the people who carried the research out, then it must be of a higher credibility. So that's the one type of paper you get. Then the other type of paper is what they call repository data or topical discourse paper. And you will notice topical discourse or repository data paper is a discussion paper. So you and I could wake up tomorrow and think, hey, we want to discuss how human beings have responded to the pandemic as a whole, and we don't go out and carry out any particular study. All we do is just take our knowledge of what we're reading from articles in the newspaper, from articles in journals, and we write our arguments based on those things without actually collecting a sample of people to collect data from and so forth. All that is repository data. So you're using data that's already kept somewhere, or you're using data that represents the current topical discourse. So there are different types. So the first type they call primary research-led publications, because there's primary research focus. There are others where you are discussing things that have been researched by others or written by others. That's secondary research. So there are two types of publications that we speak about. We speak about primary research-led publications and topical or stroke secondary research publications. One is where you're just discussing things, not having been the primary collector of the data. The other is when you have been the primary collector of the data and you are reporting what you did. So then the other thing we're going to do is this determining how you sharpen up the topical nature of your paper, how you deal with issues of relevance. By the way, those of you who have sat through all the sessions I've done before, you will know that this issue of topicality, this issue of relevance, are things I've described before when we were talking about how you magnify your problem. If you have a research problem and you want it to ring a chord for everybody else, what you do is you look for how that research problem has expressed itself in it being a topic of current interest. So you demonstrate its topical nature, and then the relevance relates to how something that has been considered to be an important discussion point has remained important throughout the ages. So you need, when whatever paper you're writing, because we have to sell this thing, remember, you have to sell this thing so that the world want to read it, the world feel that you're making a unique contribution, the world feel that you're dealing with a substantial enough problem for them to be concerned. So that's how you just, we need to train you to be able to develop that topical edge when it comes to the paper. I've mentioned the issue around determining target publication issues and prioritizing accreditation status, impact factor. Then somewhere in all this, we have to talk about the ethics of authorship. And this, folks, with you as students, is probably the single most critical thing that you will have to consider. I've just heard a funny noise, and I just need to check something to just make sure that I'm still online and haven't been taken off. Right, okay, I'm just going to share my page again. Right. Okay, so this is where we were. Sorry, someone was at the lobby. I don't know how that happened. But in any case, here we are. So as I was saying, when it comes to this issue of the ethics of authorship, it's, wait, whoa, right. Please confirm that you're seeing everything. Right, the ethics of authorship is the last element that we will focus on, and it will come up in different guises. But basically, this is a very critical issue for you as students, because remember, with each of you, when you do your studies, the output of your study, the discoveries you make, are actually referred to as intellectual property. And with all property, there's issues about ownership. And once you have issues of ownership, then all the ethics around who is pushing who to own what percentage and all that stuff, they flare up and they become a central point of discussion. So this issue around the ethics around that is literally at the very center of what you as students will struggle with. Take, for example, the fact that when all of you write a publication and it's part of this study that you're doing, it's part of this master's or doctorate you're doing, by definition, the master's and doctorate is actually the property of the university. So I don't know if you know that, but the minute you signed up and agreed to be a master's and doctoral student, somewhere in all the paperwork you completed, one of the things that you accepted was that intellectual property belongs to UNISA. Secondly, because you develop your work under the guidance of a particular person, a supervisor or whoever, there are points when you publish something, there will be a conversation that has to be had about whether you're the only author on it or whether other authors exist and so forth. But definitely the publications that you do as a product of your study, will always have the name of the supervisor, ordinarily as the second author. So you may not know this, but in the world of publication, the order in which the author names appears is critical. So some universities will give different weighting for people who have papers that are where they are first author versus papers that they are second author to. So there's a whole lot of these debates that exist about whose paper is it, what does one have to contribute for their name to appear, and so forth. And then, of course, in this whole world of authorship, there are issues around how people might have data that needs to be analyzed, but they refer or recruit someone else to do the analysis. Does that person become a part of the authoring team or not? All those things are things that should be subjected to ethical exploration. So we will look at them. We will look at them. Now, the path to publication is simple. It's very, very straightforward. And in fact, ladies and gentlemen, because you have to be one of those, the actual path to publication is very, very, very simple. But it all is premised on you following very pedantic, sometimes mundane, but specific rules of engagement. And the reason people do not or struggle with publishing is because they try to take shortcuts, they do whatever. Many people actually don't know the actual path to publication. They don't know the path. They are sometimes compelled to publish based on very different motivations. But in an ideal world, when you are going to publish or write an article, things happen in this very specific order. You engage in some activity, some research where you gain a lot of knowledge about a particular issue, whether that knowledge you gain through you collecting data firsthand, i.e. primary research, or you gain that knowledge through reading other people's research, i.e. you have secondary research data. Whatever way you do it, all of that comprises research. As you are researching, what you are looking at are the things that I'm discovering, are my discoveries worthy of being considered groundbreaking in any way? Am I finding things that really matter? So that part is where many people get mistaken. They do research, they see things and they think, what I have to say is unique, but maybe they think it's unique because they didn't read far enough to catch other people who have written about it. So that research bit is very important, but if you do very sound research, you point out your research problem, your issue of interest, your topical that you think is worth debating, all that stuff. If you get that right in the research bit, everything else gets easier. And folks, this next step changes everything, right? So once you have researched and you're clear you have a topic, many people think, I have a topic, I'm just going to write a paper. Then they write a paper, or some of you will have your dissertation from your master's or your thesis from your doctorate, and you will be told, just summarize it into 12 pages and you have a paper. That is not what happens, folks. That is not what happens. You must treat your path to publication as someone who is trying to attend a party or an event that has a dress code. You do not just dress up, then work out where you're going to and what the code is. You don't do that. You first identify the venue, the target of where you're going. You understand the requirements of that target. Then you start to develop your paper. And so there is a story, there is a process by how you identify targets or identify target publications or target venues for your paper. there are sets of things that you do. But literally, you need to do research. You need to do research around the topic. All of you are in a topic that you've probably chosen now by virtue of whatever the title of your postgraduate study is. But you have to research unresolved issues within that field you're looking at, things that are contentious and contested and all sorts of things. Once you've done that, you think, okay, now that I have a rough idea of what I'm interested in, what are the potential venues or target publications that would consider what I have to do? And you do that so you can understand what these targets want out of you. If they want you to have a paper to write a paper that uses font size 22 Arial, it makes sense to start your very first line of your paper with that font, so you don't have to change it later. But there are many more things that they require, and I'll show you these things. Once you have done that, then once you know where this thing is going, you develop a title. That title will now be framed in the way that your venue appears to be framing titles. So you make sure that, hey, you see now their titles that they've got look like. You need to make yours the same way, short and catchy, or long and detailed, whatever route they use, you follow it. Then you do an abstract. And an abstract is really now a summary of what you intend, the directions that you intend to travel within your paper. And that, as much as it's an abstract, it's also a plan. It's also a contract you are giving to everybody else. That's right. These are the elements that will be in my paper. And you use that abstract to make sure that when you develop the paper proper, you do it well and with clarity. Then the next thing, once you have a title, you've got an abstract being a summary version of your intended paper. Best practice suggests that you go to the website of the identified venue or venues. My guidance, when we later speak about it, says that you need to identify 3 or so target journals, and ready your paper for 3 potential venues. So your paper is written in a way that would suit publication A, publication B, and publication C. Once you have done that, what you then do is develop the title, an abstract, and then you say, okay, I now know of 3 journals that I was interested in, potentially. Why don't I take my abstract and send the abstract to an editor with a very, very nicely written letter where you say, dear editor, I've been reading the journal that you're an editor for, and I find that it's got very interesting topics. I'm currently developing a paper that offers this. Then you provide the abstract. I'm interested to know what you think about this and whether you think it's worthwhile me submitting a full manuscript, full paper. That approach where you write to an editor beforehand, many, probably 95% of all people who write papers don't do that. And it's a critical error. Critical error in that if you have an editor that you send to and they don't like your 10 sentences, and they tell you they don't like your 10 sentences, it allows you to commit to a different journal very quickly. If they say, hey, this looks like something we could be interested in, they've roundabout already committed themselves to at least considering your submission. So in essence, what that means is that when you eventually submit the final paper, you would write to the editor, hi, I am Tennyson, whoever. I wrote to you 2 months ago about this paper and you encouraged me to submit. I have now attached the paper. I look forward to hearing from you. When someone is approached and you remind them that they're the ones who invited you, the chances of them refusing your submission outright reduce drastically. So that's the psychology of why you write to the editor. It tells you in advance whether they're interested or not. It also plants your paper idea in their brain for when you eventually submit. And finally, one of the biggest complaints people have about journals is that they never answer you. So a good way of getting a sense of whether a journal that you've targeted is responsive or not is to send them that abstract to the editor and see how long the editor takes to answer you. Some may never answer you. And there are lots of findings that show that once the initial behavior of a journal has a lot to do with the pace in which they are able to review the work you're submitting to them and all these other things. So that letter to the editor has many functions and it's often overlooked, but it's necessary. So the next thing then you do after you've been given an invitation to write is you develop an outline. And an outline is a much more detailed version of an abstract where you are now saying, okay, in my introduction, I want to take people through this journey, through this journey, through this journey, and you develop an outline. Then, of course, you sit down and you write and so forth. Then you submit. Of course, when you submit, never ever has a paper just been accepted outright. You will get feedback asking that you correct something or whatever. When I say never been accepted, there's some have been accepted outright, but ultimately we discover that that's the journal that accepted them has got some flaws in the way that they critically review things submitted to them. But in any case, after submission, expect something to be returned to you for corrections. But this is the part. These 6 steps are critical. So I now will walk you through the 6 steps. But the first thing is, how do you know, or how do you position yourself so that you're actually writing about something that matters? And this is how you position yourself. Remember, I've been consistent and insistent about the fact that research is about studying and understanding a problem or a phenomena that has an element of being problematic because we don't know certain parts about it. So essentially, any research output that you write rests its entire credibility on whether it is triggered by a clear problem that has no clear solution. So the very first thing you're going to say is, look, I want to write, and let me be clear about what problem my writing is going to focus on. And I want that problem to be clarified. I want it to be clear. I want the importance of the problem to be made clear. So is your decision to write about it driven by evidence, or is this just an opinion? Of course, if you're writing something on the basis of an opinion, a person who has evidence has much more of a scientifically acceptable problem than you have. Sometimes people are prompted to write about something because they went to a conference, presented a casual idea, and it generated lots of interest, and then they've realized that this problem is important. So they need to be clear about where their motivation for writing came from. And for you guys, all of you that I'm talking to now, your motivation would have come from this master's or doctoral piece of work that you have, which was centered on you trying to address a problem, and you now want to turn elements of it into a paper. So, and then that's where your primary basis for thinking, oh, I can write, comes from the fact that you have this doctorate, you have this master's, that all of which have, if they've been done properly, would have focused on a problem. They would have focused on the challenges around the problem, understanding the problem, and so forth. Then, of course, there's a clear case where someone has an initiative or they invent something that's brand new and they just want to share to the world that, look, here's something I invented, here's the paper. Any of these conditions are the basis for anyone thinking, right, I have a reason to write. Of course, when you're starting to write, not only do you focus on what you're writing, we have to have clarity about how and who you're going to write with. And with you as students, co-authorship is not only a possibility, it is actually a requirement, it's a fact of life. And don't quote me on this because different departments have different things, but some departments will say, look, the first two outputs, first two papers that the student publishes that are related to the study they did at the university will insist that they include the name of their supervisor as one of the authors. So, and this rule is not unique to UNISA, it's literally global. So it's not something that UNISA have set up, but it's kind of payback for the development that the university would have provided to you and payback for the guidance your supervisor would have provided. Then, of course, the other options is that people can write as practitioners. Some of you are in areas where you are practitioners and you face similar problems. You can write as practitioner groups, or you have groups of people who are researching similar things, or some of you might be writing about a service that you've received and you have a group of you who have experienced this service. Of course, the bigger the pool of people and the different look, then the higher the chances of a cross-disciplinary type of study that if you're doing a study that involves mathematics and also involves health, then the chances are that if you choose the right people, you suddenly get a mathematician and a health specialist working together. So, of course, with co-authorship, ideally it expresses itself in that some people write part A, some write part B, and what you don't want is for someone to be able to tell where author A stops and author B starts. So people have to have ways of managing that, and sometimes they will allow people to write individually, but they will have one person who will be the person who joins it all up so that it at least feels consistent in the way that the English around the paper is articulated. Of course, with co-authorship, each person comes in with a very specific strength. So someone might have a co-author. You might, as a student, your authorship comes from the fact that you are the conceptual force behind the paper. But there might be a lecturer who helped you with analysis. So they come in because of their analytical power and so forth. And then, of course, at the beginning of this journey where you decide all people, these are the 4 people who are writing, a conversation about who will be where matters. It matters for a number of reasons. So people's promotion potential is affected by this and so forth. Hey? So it really is important. And there's an implied understanding that the first author is seen as the real person behind the things that the paper is looking at. So once you allow yourself to be third author, then you have relinquished that perception or that identification that you are the person who came up with the idea. Now, this little flow, this system of processes that's in front of you is really trying to demonstrate something very easy, something very basic, which probably does not need to even be articulated here. But here's the thing. So papers that are submitted when papers are submitted, just submitted only, there's generally, and sorry, folks, this is a study that was carried out, and it's not, there are many others, but they all say the same thing. They all say the same thing. And these studies say the same thing, and they say that they send very similar messages, the message being that when people submit at the very beginning of the submission story, many people have their papers moved away from the submission for one reason or another. So like out of the 100% to submit, this study here showed that 24% are rejected outright. And the reasons for rejection are clear. They didn't understand the venue that they targeted, so they just wrote a paper and sent it to a place they don't understand. They obviously did not first find out about the venue, then write to target the venue. They just wrote and threw something at the venue. So literally you're going to a party that has a dress code, you don't find out what the dress code is, and you just wear any old code and you hope it will work. The chances are it won't. So that's where the initial people who are asked to revise substantially or are rejected are comprised of that. But once you submit something and it goes through the editor's desk and the editor accepts it and says this thing must now go to being first reviewed, then you recognize that the success rate suddenly increases now. So 2/3 of all the things that get to the editor, and the editor says, right, I'm sending it onward for the rest of my team to look at, 2/3 of those things are published. So the importance of that softening up the editor story suddenly becomes very clear. That actually, if you want to have a 2/3 chance of your paper being accepted, why don't you warm the editor up by sharing the abstract and getting them to commit to the fact that they like the idea of your paper, and then when you submit that paper, you remind them that, hey, 4 months ago you said you like this. Once you get through that, then immediately there's 2/3 of a chance. And I'll tell you, when people publish, if someone said you have 2/3 of a chance of your paper being accepted, we'll all be flocking there with happiness and all sorts of things. So all that has come from simply making sure that you pass that first port of discrimination where the editor makes a decision. Then we discover that actually, once things are go through first review, as long as they have not outright rejected you and you've not pulled your paper out, you ultimately end up in a position where you only really have a 2% chance of being rejected. So the issue with writing this message is simple, or the messages are simple. Make sure you submit to the right venue. Make sure that venue is expecting your work. Make sure that when they pass it through and they have the first review team say fix something and you fix it well enough, you don't give up because they've said fix it, because chances are they will ask you to fix it again. And if you do those things and just avoid that reject story, you will end up with just a 2% chance of being rejected. So ultimately, from being clear that you submit to the right person who's expecting you, if you persevere by looking at corrections, fixing them, sending them back, fixing them, sending them back, you suddenly move from 66% to a 98% chance. So the message is clear. As long as your paper is not rejected outright from the beginning, you have as good a chance as anybody else to be there. Now, When you're selecting the right journal, I've mentioned accreditation status already. Also, the type of paper you're writing is different. So you will remember at one point when I was teaching you, I introduced you to a pyramid. And I call this a hierarchy of evidence. I said it was Sackett's hierarchy of evidence. And basically, it's a hierarchy that tells you what type of paper is most valued, what type of paper is of secondary importance, and so forth. And the general idea was that it said papers that are primary research papers are much more seen as being scientifically sound than those papers that are based on secondary research. So you will find that many of the high-end journals will say, look, 80% of our papers will come from primary research and only 20% will be discussion papers, because they don't want a whole issue of a journal full of discussion papers. So, and you must check when you go to that venue, you're looking at different journals and so forth. You get to a point where you need to understand what's the journal you've chosen, what their preference of paper is. And if you have data that would only allow you to do a secondary research paper, and they tell you that they are primarily interested in primary research, then you would be advised to not make them a serious venue, because they will ultimately not be interested in your work, or they won't have space to accommodate it. Then there are particular rankings. So there are indices that exist. There's the International Scientific Index, the ISI, which is by Thomson Reuters. Same people who write, are responsible for collating data from different papers, newspapers, and so forth. But they have a ranking, and their ranking is very respected. So people talk about ISI ranking. If a journal has got an ISI ranking, it's telling you that, look, in the scientific community, I'm respected as a journal, and so that gives you a chance now to tell, this is the right journal I'm going to. Of course, you've also checked that it's accredited. And then, of course, all of us write for different reasons. Some write for mass consumption. So you decide, I'm writing a paper because I want the whole world to read it. You may actually then opt for a much more populist journal versus one that's very scientifically nuanced. Of course, because all of you are writing as a result of being on a master's and doctoral program, your limit about where you write is explicit, and it's there. You can't just choose to write in a newspaper, because newspapers are not accredited. Right. So I've spoken about low impact and high impact factor journals. So the impact factor, which is sometimes abbreviated as IF, is a measure that really gives you a sense of how often a particular journal is referred to by people in a specific field. So basically, Eugene Garfield, who came up with this indice that I was talking about, the ISI, is basically the person who first said, look, he needed to work out which journals made the most impact, and those that make the most impact do so because they're the ones that are cited the most. So when you write your current study, you could literally just go to the back of your study and say, let's see which journal most of my papers came from. And the journal that is mostly spoken about by other people such as yourselves who are researchers gets the highest note for being impactful, that it is the journal that people are citing, they are copying from, so it's the one governing the way thinking goes. The higher the impact factor, of course, the more difficult it is to get into a journal. And the variables, normally, the impact factor has a number of things that you consider. So we've spoken about the audience, about how many people reach it, and you look at that through citations. High impact factor journals tend to have outstanding research. So the journals that first reported the existence of COVID, for example, that will be a high impact factor journal, because whenever it talks about something, everyone in the field listens, they pay attention and so forth. The audience I've spoken about in terms of the reach and who it is that they're reaching. Then there are issues around length. And with length, the basic story is this. So journals tend to not, an issue of a journal tends to have limited pages, 96 pages, 100 pages. And if you have a journal that allows you to submit an article that's 25 pages, it shows that they have lots of space for you to waffle and waffle and waffle and waffle. But a journal that has a high impact factor cannot afford to have long, unnecessary long papers. So then you'll find that they manage the length. So they have shorter length in their papers. Now, all these things don't operate individually. Eh? So the length story doesn't mean that if you find a journal that has short papers, it must have a high impact factor. It has to possess all the other things for it to start to have higher impact factor. And impact factor is allocated. So there are a number of systems that exist. There is the Garfield IF system, which goes from 0 to 4, actually. But in some places they've multiplied the 4 by 10, and then some places they've actually moved to using the impact factor scale that starts from 0 to 50. So the examples that I've given to you here are very, very popular journals. These journals, like Nature, for example, I think I have a paper in Science that I had accepted once, and I think it was accepted in 2001, and they didn't publish it till 2005 because they just are that popular, they are that forward-thinking. Many more important things happen that make your paper less important, but the waiting period is that tough. So all these journals with high impact factors closer to 50 are deemed to be high impact factors, difficult to get into journals. But as I say, this impact factor scale that I've given you is up to 50. You may come across some who use the old scale that's 1 up to 4. So they'll say to you, oh, an impact factor journal, that the impact factor of journal X was 2. And once they use that, people know that's a high impact factor journal, because very rarely do you have a journal with an impact factor of 3 or even 4. In fact, they probably don't exist. So that's the story. But with all this impact factor, other areas such as the Chinese have come up with their own impact factor scale that goes up to 100. So you'll find many journals saying, oh, they have an impact factor of 76. The minute you know it's that high, you know it's not the 1 to 50 scale. You know it's not the 1 to 4 scale. It is another scale that's being used. So, but that scale, the newer the scale is, the less respected it is. So certain impact factors are not respected. Okay, so when you are now maximizing the chances of this, remember we've been deciding where the paper is going. Now you need to maximize the chances of your paper getting into these places where you think it should go. The first thing is you need to say remember there's that part where I say the first thing you do is research. So when you're researching, you start to say, oh, what are the 3 or 4 worthy research problems that seem to be coming out of all the papers? You note those things. Then you think, okay, so if I were to pursue these things, what is the literature that I need to demonstrate that these things are significant? What is the literature I need to show people insights of the different debates that exist in the story that I'm interested in? What is it that I need to show that these things, these 3 or 4 questions I'm interested are topical, they are the here and now debated issue? What is it that I need to show that these 3 or 4 things that I've chosen are problems that are age-long and have been around forever? So essentially, if you do a good job of this thing, you now have 3 or 4 viable questions that you want to look at. The reason you have 3 or 4 viable questions, folks, is if you're going to research for weeks and weeks and weeks, you will find more than one clue or one hunch that's worth investing in. So you invest in all 3 or 4 and you see which one carries and which one doesn't. Because as you proceed further, once you've got these 4 worthy questions, you will now think, okay, let me see what journals will talk about this thing I'm interested in. So you go for journals, and the way you find journals is each university, or if you go online and you put DHET, as in DHET, accredited journals. All the universities have lists and lists of these accredited journals, and it tells you all the journals that are there and which one is for this, which field, and so forth. So you can find potential journal titles. And then remember, you have to use the DHET accredited list only. But you now have all these 4,000, 5,000 journals to choose from. And you have these 3 or 4 worthy questions. Then you ask yourself, which of these 4 questions can fit or be substantially exciting to 3 or 4 journals? So you'll find that out of your 3 or 4 worthy questions, maybe not all 3 or 4 are worthy anymore, because the journal titles, the venues that you're finding, are not as interested in this. How you discover if a venue is interested is every journal has got a website. On the website, they will tell you what the scope of their journal is, what they're interested in, what they're not interested in. They will show you back issues, recent issues of their work that will tell you exactly what it is that people have been writing about, what is the debates that have gained momentum in their journal. So you know that when you're pursuing a particular venue, you're doing so because they've demonstrated an interest in things that are similar to what you have. And then you do this thing of developing a hierarchy of preferred journal titles. And that is you saying, look, I have these 4 journal titles that I want. How do I decide which one is my best one? And the story is simple. Folks, as students, you are entry-level writers. So you want a journal that's accredited, yes, but you don't want a journal with such a high impact factor that it only takes work from prolific professors. You want a journal that's accredited, but one that's still quite open, either because it publishes very often, so it can take more papers than most, or it just has an open mind about these things. So when you're having a hierarchy, your hierarchy would start with you deciding which of these journal titles look like the easiest for you to get into, which one looks like it will be a little bit more difficult, which one looks like it will be more difficult, and which one looks the most difficult. And once you have that, there are a couple of schools of thought around this. The first school of thought says, look, If you think your questions are worthy, apply to the best journal. So when they turn you down, you go to the one next below it, or so forth and so forth. Then there's some that say, look, as a student, you know that you are more interested in being accepted, full stop, and not about who accepts you. So you apply to the lower end journals. So, but that story is essentially, I mean, it's no different from, if you think of, and I'm going to use an example people think is funny, but it makes the idea stick in your head. Imagine you went to a nightclub or to some event where people go and meet each other, and you are a prospective person looking for a partner. You would go in there and look for the most handsome or the most beautiful. Then you would see someone else who's second, who's third, who's fourth. Some people would say, look, your job is to find the best possible person and approach them and see if they'll accept you. And if they say no, you go to the next one until you go to the one right at the bottom. Because the thing that you may lose if you decide that, look, here's the candidates I'm looking at, and that one is too top-notch for me, you might actually aim for the very bottom, and the bottom will accept you, but you'll always be wondering whether your work or you would have been accepted by the level higher and higher and higher. And that's essentially what this process of giving a hierarchy to your journal titles is. Do you want to attempt the best and work down, or are you just going to start from the low end and work onwards? So, and then of course, whenever you're writing a paper, make sure that you get the guidance that's set up by that journal for authors. You print it, you have it next to you. So when you write, if they say that the first paragraph should be this, you do so and you do it immediately. Now, what this slide tells you is it tells you everything that I've said already. And the first thing that I've said already is that if you avoid being desk rejected, so desk rejection means when you submit a paper and it hits the desk of the journal and they go, oops, this is not our type of paper, let's reject it. If you pass that part, you immediately jump into a group of people who have a 2/3 chance of getting through. And if you pass the first rung of that, you suddenly have a 98% chance of getting through. And I have told you the secret to avoid desk rejection. Send something to an abstract to the editor. Say, I've seen your journal, I love it, it's great, it's this, it's that. I'm just working on a paper that will focus on this. I wonder whether your journal has appetite to consider such submissions. And then they will tell you. And always when you submit things to a journal, there's an expectation that you write a cover letter. It just humanizes you. You're not just applying without saying something. So it humanizes you a bit. Now, of course, when you identify a potential home for your paper, that venue that I'm talking about, there are lists that exist which have all the articles that you are allowed to even consider. And this list involves 6 lists that the Department for Higher Education and Training consider to be accredited papers. And that list is this ISI, IBSS, the South African list. There's one called Scopus, the Skylo SA, and then the Norwegian list. You don't have to know much else about this, except that if you go online and you put list of list of accredited journals in South Africa, you will get an Excel document that will have 3 Excel files or 6 different Excel files, an ISI Excel file, IBSS, and all those things. And any journal that is on that list is is a journal you can approach. And as I say, there's 4,000 of them. The sorts of things you look at are impact factor. Sometimes people even look at the frequency of a publication. If a journal says, look, we publish every month, and another journal says we publish every 18 months, clearly, if you want a paper out quick and you are a student whose graduation depends on a paper, you would know which one to choose. What I've said is, it is important that you identify more than one venue. Each journal has back issues, like previous papers have published. Always make sure you get a couple of papers from the back issues, so you realize what style of writing they have, what divisions they use for their subheadings, whether they include diagrams in their papers, all those sorts of things. Read that along with the author guidelines. Then, of course, there are some administrative tasks that are usually involved, that if you identify a journal, they'll say, hey, if you're going to submit to us, you need to register. Then, of course, there's that issue of emailing an abstract to the editor. So that's the first bit of you knowing where to go. I've given you some things here, that the first thing that you do is you go to the journal venue and you look at the scope of the journal. What is it that the journal says? Is it interested in debates right now? Is it interested in papers on criminal behavior or whatever? Check if it aligns with you. Is it a prestigious journal or not? And that you determine from the impact factor and other things about whether it's gold standard or not. How many issues does it have a year? The more issues it has, the higher the chance of you publishing. The fewer the issues, the lower the chance. But ironically, you'll find that the very prestigious ones don't have many issues. So you may have to sacrifice the number of issues if you want high prestige. Is it national or international? The reason we ask that is currently South Africa will reward and acknowledge international papers differently from national journals. For whatever reason, they say that international journals are rated higher than national ones. But that we could debate for the longest time, but that's just how it is. And then, is it refereed and how? So now, when we say refereed, we're talking about how are the papers that arrive reviewed. And there are 4 different levels of how papers are reviewed. And this is important, eh? The higher the level, or the more complicated the review process, the more respected the actual process is. The least respected and most open to manipulation is a journal that has an editor alone. They just have a single person who's an editor. He or she receives all the work, they review it, they decide whether they like it or not, you're in or out. Then there are some that have an editorial board. So it's a group of people now, 4 or 5 people, who sit together and they look at papers, probably all at once, and they discuss the paper and they decide which paper they like, but they do it collectively as a board. They sit for an afternoon, and once people sit together, if one person says, I hate this paper, chances are everybody else will say the same. So then the next level is this peer reviewed. So peer reviewed is when the papers arrive at the journal, and then the journal has a list of experts and peers in the field that they consider to be experts, and they are then sent out the paper as it is for them to review it, and they send back their comments. Of course, this peer review thing does not state whether the reviewers know what the other has said or so forth, but the next level is much more scientifically sound. So they talk about blind peer reviewed. Basically, what this blind peer reviewed, they usually talk about it either being single blind or double blind. But double blind, or the best way to think about this is with peer reviewed, the option 3, there are 2 forms of it. There's peer reviewed where the reviewer knows who the person who wrote the paper is. And apart from reviewing the paper, they have the option of Googling you and checking up on you and stuff. That's just peer reviewed. Blind reviewed is when, blind single peer reviewed is when the person reviewing it has no knowledge of who wrote the paper. It could be you, the student, it could be a prolific professor. All that detail is removed and they just review the paper and they're blind to other elements about it. But double blind peer review is when you have more than one reviewer. All of them are blind to everything that's possible to be blind to. They don't know who the other reviewer is. They don't know who submitted it. They don't know what the review outcome of the other person is. So when they respond, all of them are literally giving as objective a view about the paper as possible. And this last option, this double blind peer reviewed, is considered to be the gold standard of review. So when people are saying, how was your paper or how does your journal review papers, these are the options that are available to you. And the more blind the process is, the more peer driven it is, the more people in the process, the more respected it is. Now, I've mentioned author guidelines up to this point, and this is where actually I want to stop for today, because all I wanted to do was to get you to understand how you position yourself to getting to the paper. So the last bit that I want to show you is, once you have gone to this DHET list that I was talking about, and you look at the different journals, each of them, you can Google search them, and you'll find that they have a front page that looks something like this one. And in some shape or form, they tell you what the guidelines are. So this one tells you that this journal is interested in workforce issues. It's interested in mental health services, and it looks at the issues to do with workforce development, training, and education. So as long as your papers are in that respect, that's what they're interested in. They've not said much else about what it is they want. They speak about submissions. They also say the papers should be MS Word. But they give you, interestingly, they give you the names of 2 editing individuals. So if I were you, what I would do then is take those names of the editing individuals, say, hello, Di Bailey, hello, P. Ryan, I am preparing a paper on this. I've attached the abstract. I'm just interested whether this paper looks like it would have the type of content that you would be interested in. So then what we do tomorrow is developing the manuscript where I walk you through the elements of a paper. So I said critically, you have to do research around the paper. I've told you how you go about doing that. I've told you how you make sure you have 3 or 4 potential things you discuss. I've told you about how you identify a venue. I've told you about how you segregate good venues from not so good venues. I've told you about how you decide which venues you will approach first. And by the way, just as a parting shot, you are not allowed as a researcher working on a paper to submit your paper to more than one place at a time. Hey, so when you have an article, that article has to be submitted at any one time to only one journal source, hey? Only one journal source. And once you have given it to that source, you are not allowed to allow any other journal to consider the paper. They can't consider the paper as long as your paper is under consideration by another journal. So, and of course, when you submit to that high preferred journal that you had, and they take 3-4 weeks to reject you, once they give you a rejection letter, you can now take that paper and submit it to the next journal, and so forth. But you cannot have a single paper under consideration in 2 places at the same time. Right, I hope that I've clarified some things about the journey. Look, the detail of how you enter into writing is very specific, folks. And if you do a good job of it, I tell you, you will be in that group of people who is either 66% assured of a publication or 98% assured of it. And those odds are great by any account, particularly for students, given that you are mostly novice writers and so forth and so forth. Look, right, let me get to this thing. So, is publication a must at UNISA? Look, all your graduation requirements insist that students, particularly doctoral students, must have a publication or 2 before they can be allowed to graduate. But all of that is subject to circumstance. So if a student writes 2 articles and they take forever to be admitted or accepted for that matter, but they complete the thesis, the supervisor can make a case for you to be allowed to graduate. But on paper, it is a requirement. But whether in real life it turns out that way is different. Does this mean that I can't convert my thesis into a book? Folks, the answer is they are what we call vanity publications, where people just publish because they are literally academically vain. So they publish because they want to just see a book with their name on it. And to be honest, you can do that. You can do that. But that thesis will not be accredited and it will not count as an academic publication. It's no different from you going to a friend who's got a binding machine at home and they just bind for you. So that thing where you see people converting their theses into books, it's more a vanity process rather than a scholarly one. And yeah, and many people do that thinking, oh, this will change things. There are many places that sell the idea that come or publish for you and will put it on Amazon. If that place is not accredited and it's not on that list that I referred to, you've got a problem. There's someone who's asking about my opinion publishing in South African journals. Folks, you can, as long as something is on the accredited list, you can publish in it. The determination about whether something is good or not is as little to do with where the journal is. It is more to do with all the other factors that I've mentioned up to this point, the way in which what impact factor is given and so forth. The only challenge is the Department for Higher Education and Training they needed to emphasize that people publish outside South Africa. So they've given different incentives for people who publish outside the country. So generally they incentivize international publications more than South African ones, but that's nothing really to do with quality per se. It's more to do with a priority that DHET wanted to pursue. Prof, can one write as many articles from a thesis? Folks, look, I've heard people saying, oh, they do 8 papers from a thesis. The truth of it is, if you find rubbish journal spaces, you may be able to publish 8, 20, but realistically, it's never that many. People do 2 or 3 things, and This idea that you publish from a thesis is actually a misconception. A thesis is written for a very specific purpose, and an article is written for a different purpose. So the people will copy and paste things from theses and try and turn them into papers. There was a time you could do that. You can't really do it now because the competition is so fierce. You really have to redesign, rethink. I mean, if you think about a thesis, you spend a lot of time defining things. In a paper, you don't do any of that. So there's clearly a different audience, and as such, you need to write differently. Prof, how does one find those editors? I think I've answered that question. You go to the author to the website of the journal, and it will specifically indicate all those things. Good evening, Prof. Are we the first year PhD students that you notified to submit the paper after 2 weeks? No. I'm not sure what this question is. Sorry, folks. All I've said was I said that in 2 weeks' time, we will be inviting people who have work that they wish to have reviewed. We will be happy to assist you. It doesn't have to be accepted work. If you have written a few pages and you just want to see if they make sense from our position, we will consider it. But it's just to help you to make sure that you're not writing in the dark on your own. Does the UNISA assist with funding for publication as approved and the PhD student has to present a paper at a conference? If your paper has been accepted somewhere, accredited, of course, the expectation is your supervisor will be also part of the publishing team, in which case each supervisor has got a research fund, and most supervisors, most of us will fund our students, but it's not a requirement. It's not a requirement. It's more of a gentle person, gentleman, gentle ladies agreement. When can one write a journal? I don't know what that means. Or when can one write a journal? I don't know if the question is when can you write to a journal? When you have the abstract. I think please go back to my slides that I've presented. There were only 18 slides. The answer is there somewhere that gives you a sense of these things. Okay, so Mogak is asking about how does one manage to reduce the impact of publishing articles from the thesis on the similarity index of the thesis? Right, okay, so if you accept that a thesis and a journal article are actually not the same thing, they might be talking about the same idea, but there's very little commonality. So you shouldn't really be seeing a part of your thesis that you can take carte blanche and put into an article. It shouldn't happen like that. I know many of you have been guided to do that, but it's actually not publishing. It's not a publishing standard. It's more of a thing that has happened over the course of time, but it certainly is something that doesn't get promoted. And I'm an editor for a few journals, and if we get a sense that your work sounds like a thesis, we throw it out the window as quick as possible. Are we as students expected to have your paper actually published in credible journals before graduating? I think I've answered that. On paper, yes, you are. Remember, it's just that people these days have an expectation that they do a microwave PhD, but the tradition of PhD is they took 3-4 years at least. And in that time, maybe your literature review will be something you do in year 1, and you can spend the next year and a half remodeling it, rethinking it, writing differently. So you turn its elements into a paper, not it into a paper. Please advise on the issue of a systematic literature review. So look, as students, it is highly improbable that you will write a systematic review, and it's even less probable that it will be accepted. So a systematic review really is someone taking all different types of literature about a subject, putting them together and offering a world-class view about what they think is going on. Would you ask that from a novice, such as a student, or would that be expected from someone who has been in the field and has been there for a while? So with systematic reviews, I know supervisors sometimes say a student should do it. The truth of it is a student cannot do it because you have not been embedded in the field long enough to write it. That's the official position. You may meet others who suggest otherwise, but the official position is about that. And as I said, if you go and look at all the journals you approach, you will notice that they very rarely invite systematic reviews as the things that they are interested in, without them adding a specific requirement that the systematic review has to be written in this way or that way or that way. How many articles are expected to publish for doctoral students? I thought I said that there's no one set requirement, but on general, I think it's 2 that students are meant to have published, but you can have 1 submitted for publication, then another ready to be submitted. But please, folks, go to your specific master's and doctoral procedures for your colleges and check, because they all have revised it depending on what the ease of publication in your specific field is. Please, at what point in your thesis development is one expected to submit an article? Well, you remember there's many points at which you can have an opportunity to write something about. So when you're researching the actual paper, the actual thesis, you may come across some pertinent questions and develop an article around that. You may develop an article when you finish your data collection. So that answer is it can happen anywhere. And you will not submit a paper that does not include your supervisor. So there is no way that you can submit an article without the university knowing, because you can't submit a paper without one of the authors knowing, and your supervisor is always one of the authors. Okay, someone, there's something that talks about, someone's acknowledging that the presentation is similar to something they've read. Thank you for that. This is a reassuring thing. How do we select the parts of a thesis to publish into 2 articles or more? I'm stating once again, folks, your thesis is not what turns into papers. There are things in your thesis that are interesting, you expand on them and you turn them into papers. But this idea, and it's an idea that's been perpetuated a lot by supervisors and others and all sorts, that you just go to your thesis and you pick 10 pages and you publish them. It is not like that. We reject doctoral things that look like they are from theses and from dissertations all the time, just because it is written in a very different way. You will accept that a journal article and your thesis are different. One is intended to be written over a long period, so it doesn't have any exciting peaks. The journal article is meant to be much shorter, so it gets to the point much quicker. It also assumes people know many of the principles that are being discussed, so you don't get a thing where in journal articles people define things. They don't. So that's basically the thing. Of course, the material that guides the things you'd be interested in are somewhere in your thesis, but to actually think you can take your thesis and take bits to write up, it's as bad as anything. And all my students, I advise them against it. And generally, all of mine graduate with 2-3 publications easy. And it's the thing they do is to just follow the guidance I gave you around how you look for an interesting angle, how you justify it, how you pinpoint it, and so forth. So on that point, I see a couple of thank you notes. And folks, we have the journey of identifying the right place for your paper, the identifying the right topic, problematizing it well. It's as important as everything else. And this is why, even in the world of marketing, people will sell everything on first impression, that you buy stuff because the first impression was excellent. And then later you discover that, hey, we've exhausted everything here because the impression bought you, but the rest didn't keep you there. And the story is the same with publications. If the problem is hard hitting, you make it critical, you make it necessary, then everything else just becomes an addition to an already accepted paper. But the structure I will show you, and I will speak you through the structure tomorrow. So on that note, I want to thank you all and say have a good night, and we'll meet up tomorrow, same time, same place. Have a good night.